My name is David McLennan. I'm Managing Director of the NYU Abu Dhabi Research Institute and a Vice Provost for Research here. Before I introduce our speaker, let me just say a few words about the Research Institute. Of course, every time you come to one of these events, you have the big logo of the Institute, and it's well known for these public lectures, for conferences, for workshops, etc. But it also has another part, and that's a research funding part that supports advanced research centres and labs at NYUAD. And this was set up really to fast-track research at the university as we're building our faculty, as their research is organically growing over time. There was felt a real need by the university and by Abu Dhabi government, for that matter, to get some high-profile, high-priority sort of research centres established here. And so funding was made available to do just that. And at the moment we've established about 12 major centres of various sizes, and they're in areas that are both of significant local interest, such as diabetes, such as public health, such as translations of classic Arabic literature, such as the genomics of date palms and algal biofuels, to research areas that are of truly global significance, such as climate change and global sea level change and cybersecurity. We held a very successful workshop here yesterday concerning cybersecurity. So the university has about a dozen of these centres now established, and our speaker tonight is a co-principal investigator of one of these centres, the Centre for Prototype Climate Modelling. And I'm sure Shafer will talk a little bit more about that. So Shafer Smith is an Associate Professor of Mathematics and Atmosphere Ocean Science at the Centre for Atmosphere Ocean Science at Courant Institute for Mathematical Sciences at NYU. He's also a Professor of Mathematics teaching linear algebra here at NYU Abu Dhabi at the moment. His research is focused on large-scale turbulence in planetary fluids, particularly Earth's oceans and atmosphere. A major goal of his work is to increase our understanding of how such turbulent motions transport heat and other constituents, and to improve the representation of these processes in global climate models. Shafer received his Bachelor of Science in Mathematics and Physics from the Indiana University at Bloomington, and his PhD in Physics from the University of California at Santa Cruz. Please welcome Shafer Smith.
Thank you. And yes, I'd like to thank the Institute. I've been here for half the semester so far, both teaching and in my role as a co-PI in one of the centers that was funded by the Institute. And the goal of the center is to use a whole array of, to look at a whole array of possible ways to improve climate models, to sort of bridge a gap between theoretical advances at the university level with the actual operational methods used in global climate forecasting labs. So I have one little small part of this, and the center is just being spun up, and we're just now hiring people. This talk is not going to have really anything to do with that except for the minorest part. Not knowing anything about the audience or how these things worked, I opted for a relatively pretty simple introduction to modern oceanography, a bit of history, and my major goal, I would say, is to simply convince you that oceanography, dynamical oceanography, is a ridiculously young field. And so I'm going to start off talking about our kind of views of the ocean and sort of show you what this talk is not really about. Okay, so I sort of imagine when I talk to people about oceanography and say I work on physical oceanography, and what comes to mind when people hear about oceanography? Well, I mean, a very common image these days is to think about the polar bears and the melting ice caps and the fate of sea creatures, and so it links into questions of global warming and global climate, and of course that's a very important offshoot of the kinds of things that the center I'm involved in is trying to work on, but we don't work directly on something that considers polar bears. and we think of, a beach and surface waves, or if you think about dynamics in the ocean, its motion, we tend to focus on the things that we can see and the things we can perceive in a human time and space scale. And, maybe you've dove and what part of the ocean do you even see or perceive? It's really only, and this is a crucial thing I'll try to get across, is that light in the ocean only penetrates at a maximum of about 100 meters. By 100 meters depth, in most places in the ocean, the light has attenuated to 1% of the value it had at the surface. So the ocean, as you know, if you've ever dove down a little bit, becomes very dark very quickly. So our view of the ocean interior is kind of limited to this pleasant, environment where cute sea creatures live in the upper ocean. And there's also kind of this just general feeling of it being this romantic, foreboding abyss. That's what this is supposed to sort of represent. So and before going on to what I'm going to talk about, let's contrast that with our view of the atmosphere. Okay, so I think the atmosphere, even though the scales of motion, well, I haven't really said what the scales of motion in the ocean are, but I think it's apparent to everybody when you think of the atmosphere, you know what clouds look like, and you know that when you see clouds, those clouds are representing the dynamics. They are what we would call a tracer, that are kind of tracing out the motions of the airflow. And because these clouds and different kinds of water vapor and ice, when we have dramatic storms, follow these things and show us them, we have a really kind of intimate feeling that the atmosphere is a very dynamic, three-dimensional, turbulent fluid that can do all sorts of crazy things. So I'm really just talking about the perception level so far, nothing deep, nothing scientific so far. Just pointing out that how we think about these two fluids, which I will try to convince you are mathematically really very similar, and how we perceive them as humans is very different. So, we perceive very dramatic things like a supercell, a tornado, and even simple clouds, and more dramatic clouds. But that's mainly my point. And it's also the case, getting a bit more scientific, that in fact our scientific understanding of the atmosphere has largely relied on the fact that we can see through it. And the fact that we have for quite a while been able to see the atmosphere and be able to see through it and perceive the entire three-dimensional structure from space has given us, and even from weather balloons, has given us a richer feeling for the data and the structure of the circulation in the atmosphere. And in fact, theories for the atmospheric general circulation were already very complex and deeply mathematical by the 1930s. Whereas the ocean, we'll see even relatively simple theories for its structure. Some are still forthcoming and were developed quite a bit later. And that's largely because, if I was going to give you one thing to remember about the difference between the atmosphere and the ocean, it's because we can't see through it. And this has severely limited our ability to imagine what kind of motions are there and what kind of models to build to understand the motions when we see them. So, a little outline of the talk. So, I'm going to give you a very brief and completely insufficient history of oceanography, of course. Again, my main focus is just going to be what's happened and how in some fields, theories, one makes an observation and one generates a theory, and the theory makes new predictions and one goes out and tests that. The ocean and the atmosphere too, for that matter, are simply too large to conduct controlled experiments on, so we're kind of always reacting to them as scientists. And so what's happened in the history of oceanography is that observers in the beginning, seafarers and sailors made observations and noticed things, and some interested, smart person spent some time trying to understand that and coming up with some ideas, and it's always been the case that the theory is kind of followed. And because it's been so difficult to observe the ocean, because we haven't had a global view of it, and even when we've had a local view, we can't see into it, it turns out that the models for our understanding of the ocean are pretty simple up to a point. And but one reason to care a lot about what may be going on inside there, and I'll get to this towards the end, it's a little bit out of order, is the biological pump. It turns out that the little bugs, phytoplankton, that live in the surface of the ocean play a massive role in the carbon cycle of the Earth. So we'll come back to that and try to say how that in fact links up to more recent observations of very small scale exotic dynamical features in the ocean. And mostly I'm going to try to go through the history, point out a couple simple models, and then point out a kind of smattering of a few recent observational techniques and results that have given us a much richer view of what's going on. But it's all really just going to be a bit of a teaser. So I'm not actually going to start with the first thing, which was the map that I put on the flyer for this guy. I'll come back to that at the end. But one of the first attempts to put together observations into some kind of coherent picture of the circulation of the ocean was this map made by Benjamin Franklin of the Gulf Stream in around 1770. So at the time, Franklin was a deputy postmaster, and he was asked by England to figure out why it was that mail routes leaving arriving at different points in the U.S. that seemed to be about the same distance from England took much longer in some cases than others. So, of course, if you're a sailor, what you notice are the winds. The winds are much stronger than the ocean currents. The ocean is moving, but even that was not something known at the time, right? So what the sailors know is there's this body of water, and they're following the winds, and they know how to navigate those. But the effect of the ocean currents, which were much smaller and slower, were not really understood. And in fact, it was kind of anecdotal and piecemeal evidence from looking at bubbles and whaling tracks and various things that led sailors to believe that there was some kind of current system that ran along the east coast of the U.S. And so Benjamin Franklin tried to put all this evidence together and come up with a sort of map of this current system, and then tried to convince the Postal Service in England to utilize this to compute trajectories in a more intelligent way. Apparently it took a long time, but eventually they did, and it helped. I didn't actually include the clip, but because I figured maybe not enough people have seen it, but this kind of early view of the Gulf Stream is actually a lot like the view of the East Australian Current in the movie Finding Nemo. Has anybody seen this? It's a kid's movie. There's a cute image of turtles and fish that are inside this kind of laminar tube that's much faster than the neighboring water. So it's a kind of example of our strange conceptions of how the ocean works. So then it's, so the observations that are leading to our view of the ocean at this point are really just ship-going observations. So all the merchant ships that are crossing the sea all the time are collecting data. They are one of the only ways we've had to collect data up until very recently is to basically take buckets of water out of the ocean and analyze their temperature and salinity and try to put together some kind of three-dimensional picture from that. So you can imagine what a daunting and ridiculous task that is. But so Matthew Maury was one of the first people to try to take in all the evidence he could get his hands on to make some kind of consistent picture of both the current system and the winds. He wrote what's generally considered the first text on the geography of the ocean, the physical geography of the sea, 1855. He was also the founder of the Naval Observatory. He basically pored over thousands of ship logs to construct maps of currents and make sort of maps that would help guide sailors to decide where to go and where not to go. One really interesting thing he did is he actually asked sailors to put messages in bottles, and on these messages was a little note asking the finder to please contact Maury and tell them where they found the bottle. I don't know exactly how they got that information across, if it lands on the coast of South Africa and he's in New England, but apparently he collected that data over a long period of time and used that to help kind of inform his knowledge of the currents. So from an oceanographic point of view, we would call those the first Lagrangian measurements, where Lagrangian is a term we use that's after a mathematician named Lagrange for a view of the water that's following individual little parcels of mass. So little parcels of mass trace out a trajectory, and we try to take that information and figure out what the mean circulation is doing. So one of the things Maury was also interested in was trying to understand, not just to map out the winds. Well, they know, again, from the oceanographic point of view, they know there's a current system in the ocean, but the winds are the main thing. So he and many others at the time tried to understand why there were easterly winds that go from the east to the west close to the equator, and westerly winds at higher latitudes. And he had a theory, along with others, tried to come up with an idea. This was a map. I'm just kind of making a connection because this figure was in his book, and there you can see he has these winds that are sort of moving towards the equator and then pushing this way. And these winds look a little bit off. This is not really what they do. He's got them pointing northward. But let's go to a slightly better schematic. So this is a schematic from a paper in 1882 by Thompson, who tried to put together various theories that have been proposed for the structure of the mean winds. And you can see his very simple schematic here is that winds at the equator tend to flow towards the west, sort of equatorward and westward. And north of the tropics, there's a kind of general westerly wind, but he's got it represented as being rather disorganized. Nevertheless, you can get the sense of a kind of mean flow towards the east, which meteorologists call westerly. If we use some modern data and we kind of average around the globe to see what the structure of those winds is, the plot looks like this. So that's 0. And these are the values of the velocity from west to east. So there it's positive, meaning the wind is flowing from west to east. Yes, so to make that a little bit clearer, these mean winds give us the sense of these westerly winds moving towards the east and the easterly winds moving to the west. Those easterly winds were called the trade winds. They still are, and that's what was used by Christopher Columbus, of course, to get to the Americas. So they wanted to understand, of course, why is the structure of the winds the way it is? And this kind of goes back to, there's a little bit of math we have to think about, very simple stuff. And this goes actually back to an idea from Hadley in the 1700s. And it's actually kind of a pleasantly simple idea to get the main result of why it is we have a jet stream in the mid-latitudes. So if you think about air at the equator, so the equator is hot. Most of the sun's energy enters the earth at the equator, and it heats up the ground, and parcels of air are very moist and buoyant, and they rise. And that continues to happen. Air is rising, so that air, as it rises up, gets pushed northward and southward towards the poles. So, of course, we're on a rotating planet, rotating at this frequency omega, which is 1 over a day. And so as those parcels rise and they get pushed northward, well, the radius from the center of the Earth, you can think of that as a sort of cross-section of a ring of air. And as you push this ring of air northward, its radius to the axis of rotation decreases. So what's going to happen? It's exactly what happens to an ice skater that spins. When she pulls her arms in, she spins faster, and that's an expression of conservation of angular momentum, okay, which is also what keeps you up on a bicycle. It's very hard to change the rotation axis of a wheel. But the main thing to think about is the ice skater. So that ring of air, as it gets forced northward and gets a smaller radius, is going to have to spin faster. Okay? And so it's getting accelerated, and that's basically, in a nutshell, what gives us the jet stream. A gazillion details we're leaving out, but in a very simple level, that's what gives us a jet stream. How the air returns and why it sinks in mid-latitudes and returns, and how the actual easterlies are generated is slightly more complicated. I'll skip over that and leave this as sufficient to give this idea of a general understanding of why we have a structure of winds like this. And then, to sort of summarize it, so just to make the point, even though it's beyond the very simple theory I just gave you, what really happens in the atmosphere is air rises at the equator and it sinks in the mid-latitudes and returns, and there are actually two more cells like this that happen in mid-latitudes and high latitudes. This most equatorward cell is called the Hadley cell, after Hadley. There's a cell here that's called the Farrell cell that's an indirect, it's got the opposite sense of rotation, and then a cell that's close to the pole. It's not too important for what I want to get to. I mainly want to get to thinking about the structure of these winds, easterlies at the equator and westerlies in the mid-latitudes, and how these generate ocean currents. So, over time, now passing forward, collecting all of this ship-going data, by the early 1900s, we had a pretty good picture of what the surface currents actually looked like in the ocean. And so this is a figure, I think, from a paper in the 40s. And what you see in every basin are what we call gyres, kind of giant swirling circulation patterns. Okay, and again, this is a sort of blurry-eyed, rough picture that's come from accumulating evidence from ships over long periods of time. So it's necessarily only going to give you a view that is sort of integrated over months or years. So it's very much a kind of an average picture that is going to wash out any kind of shorter time scale, smaller spatial scale features in the actual circulation. Nevertheless, when you do average the real circulation, it does tend to look like this, so this is fairly accurate. So the question is, why is it we get these large swirling patterns in the ocean? Again, following with the theme, here's an observation. It took many centuries to get to the point where we could kind of see that that was there. Then how do we understand why it's there, even knowing it's a kind of blurry picture? So how is it that these winds generate that? So let's just, as an example, consider just this gyre that's in the North Atlantic, and look at it a bit closer. And what happens is you see that there's kind of there's the Gulf Stream, which is this same intense current that goes northward along the southeastern coast of the U.S. that Franklin made a map of. This Gulf Stream turns out at around Cape Hatteras and enters the ocean interior. And then it kind of spreads out, and much of the water mass in the Gulf Stream starts to turn southward in a much more gentle return flow. So there's sort of like a pipe is moving along the coastline, and then it fans out. So the volume of water per area has decreased. Carl says you can't hear me. So as it fans out here, much of the water starts to move southward in this kind of broad, gentle southward return flow, and then re-enters. So of course it's not really a closed circulation pattern, but there's enough there to at least consider how that, taking it as an idealized example, trying to understand how that closed circulation pattern could work. So here's an observation. And so the first person to come up with a kind of plausible theory for why the circulation patterns in the major oceans look the way they do was a Norwegian, I'm not showing my notes, Swedish or Norwegian? Norwegian I'll go with. He was Norwegian. Harald Sverdrup in the early 40s understood, so this is going to get a little bit more complicated, but now I want to try to give you a kind of meaningful model for why those gyres exist. Okay, so that's a schematic of the Earth. So it's rotating in this sense, right? And this would be the equator. And now we can think of kind of a generalized ocean. This ring around there is supposed to be water. So you now imagine a little parcel of water kind of close to the equator like this. Gravity is pulling it inward, and it's sort of circulating in this plane. It's sort of in a direction along that line. All the while, because you're on this rotating planet, there's a rotation vector that is coming out of the North Pole. So if you're a parcel of water down here at the equator, in fact, that rotation is completely perpendicular to your sort of horizontal motion. So in fact, mathematically, we'd say that parcel at the equator doesn't feel the Coriolis force, which is the sort of fictional force that you get from the fact that you're in a rotating frame of reference, but that is largely responsible for all the kind of swirling motions we see in the atmosphere and ocean on a large scale. So as we go more and more north, and that orientation of that parcel gets more and more aligned with the rotation axis of the Earth, those parcels feel the spin of the Earth more intensely and are become more and more controlled by the spin of the Earth. In fact, at mid and high latitudes, at the scales of the motions I'm talking about in the atmosphere and ocean, the predominant influence on the circulation of these parcels is the rotation of the Earth. They tend to take on the same rotation rate as the background rotation from the Earth, each little parcel of water. And so I've tried to represent schematically this in a vector sense. So this rotation vector is always pointing out of the North Pole. At low latitudes, it has a very small projection on the vertical direction for this parcel. As I move more and more northward, that projection gets larger and larger. Okay? So basically, as a parcel moves northward, it feels the spin of the Earth and is more controlled by the spin of the Earth. So let's now put this together with this gyre picture, and now also take into account that we know that there are these mean winds, and these mean winds are not just a constant west to east wind. There is a shear, right? They're stronger at the north. They go to zero someplace, and then they turn into the easterlies towards the equator. So there's the winds are changing with latitude. So let's think about a little parcel of water. Here I put the arrow there because it does have the sense of the rotation, the background rotation of the Earth. And now let's consider the effect of the winds. So in this case, the winds are a little bit smaller there and getting stronger as I go north. So on that little parcel, there's one wind strength at the southern edge of it and a stronger wind at the northern edge in a kind of schematic sense. So that's providing a torque on this little parcel of water, okay? And for reasons that are beyond what I can try to explain in this, the parcel reacting to that torque wants to move to a latitude where its new spin is the same spin that the Earth has in some way. So what that's going to do, because we know, so what in this direction of shear, see it's spinning this way, and that torque is trying to sort of undo the spin it has. So it's trying to reduce the spin. Which way do we go to kind of reduce the spin effect of the Earth? Towards the equator. Okay? So there's this kind of general, that shear of the wind is going to act on the parcels, and with a shear in this direction where it's increasing from south to north, will tend to force particles in the interior to move southward. It's a fairly complicated process represented mathematically by this relationship, which is from a balance of two terms, if you know some of the math, in the momentum equations, in the presence of rotation. This is a balance between the northward momentum. Beta represents the rate of change of the Coriolis gradient as I move northward. And this is the curl of the wind stress, which is basically when the wind is primarily west-east, is this shear. It's the derivative in the y direction, the minus sign, the y being the south to north direction. So he put this theory together and argued, and this was, I don't know if it's coming across this way, but this was a little complicated, but not too complicated. It was a very elegant theory that actually turns out to explain very well much of the observed structure of the gyres. The part that theory, the first attempt to understand this did not completely understand was why the western boundary current is so intense. Shortly after, there were papers by Stommel and Munk in the early 50s that figured this out. And if you know the fluid dynamics, what's going on here has to do with vorticity conservation. Vorticity is a mathematical way to describe this kind of spin of the parcel that I'm talking about. And if we work through that, it turns out these boundary currents can only be on the western side of a basin. So a few very simple mathematical models, when put together with the measured winds. Actually, so this is using a little bit more of the theory than I showed with the measured winds to produce maps of the kind of the stream function, the typical trajectory of parcels of water over the globe. And this structure, it's not exactly right, but it's pretty close to what's observed. Okay? So in fact, Sverdrup balance is still what we use to make the first order approximation for the mean velocities in the ocean. Okay, so the main idea there is accumulated observations of some kind of fuzzy mean flow and a simple mathematical model that gets us a long way in understanding it. I won't say as much about this, but just to give you one more, we talked there about the horizontal structure, just to know what the ocean looks like. And this is something that has been known throughout this century, is that and before that, so these are lines of constant density in the ocean. And the upper 1,000 meters is exaggerated here. So the ocean is about 5,000 meters deep everywhere. And this is going from basically pole to pole along some transect in the Pacific. And you can see at high latitudes, these density surfaces tend to come up to the surface, towards the surface of the ocean. That's sensible because it's colder at the poles and colder water is denser. But the main feature you see is something called the thermocline, where there's this kind of double-lobed bowl of much lighter, warmer water that's at the surface. So we call that the picnic line or the thermocline. So the ocean in general is this very stratified structure. And just as the horizontal motion was sort of controlled by the rotation of the Earth, here the stratification is really controlled by gravity. So that's just an observation. And it was also known that there's kind of an overturning circulation, and I will say very little about this, but my main point here is how recent these dates are to come up with even very simple theories for the mean structure. So that's a paper in 1960 was the first to try to put together that surface wind-driven flow, those are the gyres, with a kind of overturning circulation that's happening underneath that's consistent with this thermocline, with water sinking at high latitudes and returning in the interior and sort of gently upwelling everywhere, and you can get a kind of consistent mean picture of the flow this way. It's insufficient, and I will get to why. But again, my main point is, by 1960, general relativity and quantum mechanics are well understood, and we have a really ridiculously simplistic model for the circulation of the ocean. It's never ceased to startle me from the first time I got into this field, how young it is. So, just a few models there. And like I said, the point is that the new models follow observations, and these observations have been incredibly sparse and insufficient. Nearly everything we've known about the ocean circulation until the 60s and 70s was from collecting water in ships, basically. And so we had no global view of the time-dependent circulation until, we'll talk about in a minute, the advent of satellite altimetry, satellites that could kind of not instantaneously, but almost instantaneously see the global ocean, but still only at the surface. They can't see inside it. But before getting to that, what is it we're going to see in those? And so this is around the same time, just before satellites were launched, they really, for the first time, oceanographers started to get a glimpse that there was a much more complicated, time-dependent set of phenomena going on in the ocean. We typically call them eddies or vortices that are moving around in the ocean. In the atmosphere, it's not surprising at all. Like I said, you can see it, and we've known since ancient man that there were vortices and complicated structures in the atmosphere. It was really not until, when many of us were alive, that they were the first observations that these structures existed in the ocean. And it's a strange lack of imagination to ever have thought that the ocean was this kind of static, slow-moving laminar body. So there were some experiments. The first one was something called the polygon experiment, where they put down in a little region of the ocean, they put what are called moored current arrays, where you tether a cable to the bottom of the ocean, and stacked along that cable are maybe 5 or 6 little instruments that measure the velocity of the water. So they put those in an array of about 200 kilometers square, and they also sent ships around back and forth to take measurements. So they did kind of an intense, shorter time scale, smaller space scale measurement of the ocean circulation. So this was, remarkably complicated. It still is to do, to get really very little data. But what they found was, even in their first attempt, was they saw a kind of elliptical vortex that passed through this array. So it's almost as if, you've been blind and you're kind of feeling around, and all of a sudden you see this thing, and, maybe you shouldn't have been surprised that it's there, but they were. And so we only had hints of these eddies there until now. It's another decade or more later. The first, actually it was the Space Lab in the early 70s was the first to have an instrument that measured the sea surface height of the ocean. Kind of, it was a proof of concept for these satellites that came later. So satellite altimetry, what is that? There are satellites that fly around, and they send radar signals down to the surface of the Earth, and they measure the transit time for those signals. So if you know exactly where that satellite is, and if you know the average surface of the Earth when nothing is moving, what we call the geoid, then any deviation from that indicates motion. So motion in the ocean. And there's a way in which we can use the fact that the Earth is rotating to actually infer surface currents from those measurements. So the first satellite like that was the CSAT satellite, which had pretty low resolution, so it didn't give us much better picture of the time-dependent ocean circulation. The first really good measurements are not until the 90s. The satellite Topex Poseidon, a joint French-US experiment, was launched in 92, and it wasn't until late 90s. It takes scientists a long time to analyze stuff, so now we're almost just barely more than a decade away that we've had a global picture of a much more complex structure. And what does it look like? So this is actually, there are many plots like this. This is one from a recent paper by Chelton et al. In 2011, kind of summarizing all the things we now see about what we call eddies in the ocean, these little vortices. So this is sea surface height anomaly, meaning deviations from this geoid. And what you see all over the ocean are these little kind of vortical circular features. And I'm not showing all the other plots, but they used tracking methods, an algorithm to sort of isolate these little guys that lasted more than a certain period of time and track where they go. These guys all tend to move westward. They tend to have both signs. There are some that are cyclonic, some anticyclonic, meaning rotating with or against the sense that the Earth is rotating. So these eddies are everywhere. And so our kind of fuzzy, mean view of the ocean all of a sudden seems not right. Now, so this satellite, these satellites, and so this picture is from a set of data from newer satellites that have been merged to provide a pretty high resolution picture. But still, the resolution to pick up those little guys is maybe 100 kilometers. And it's actually close to the size of the eddies you see. So if you take my previous point of, we didn't see something so that we didn't imagine it was there, and you think about this observation, which is incredibly recent, what should you do? You should try to maybe imagine that that's not everything, okay? That even though all of a sudden you've seen this much richer picture, still your instrumentation is limited. This synoptic view, meaning a relatively short time scale view, is actually only repeated you get a global picture about every 10 to 15 days. So it's also not instantaneous. These things can move quite a bit in 10 days. I'm going to go through a few other kinds of data to give us a kind of richer view of what we now see. It's just kind of jumping through a few images. There's a few satellites that measure sea surface temperature by simply measuring different spectral bands coming from the ocean, and in certain bands you can infer the temperature. And these things now tend to show even a finer structure than the sea surface height satellite. the altimeters. You can now see, this is maybe the typical size of one of those eddies that you saw in the other picture, but you can also see these little rippling fronts all over the place and these kind of tiny features here. And all these things are, this is representing complicated turbulent motions. I'm going to hopefully get to why we care about that. Again, now we have the sea surface temperature tends to give us a slightly higher resolution view, and all of a sudden we see more complicated stuff. It's a theme. Yet higher resolution is something that I've learned about very recently. So, by the way, the institute that I'm involved with, and the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, through our little center, sponsored a workshop that we held 2 weeks ago, where we had about 16 scientists from all over here to talk about kind of recent observations and methods of incorporating the kind of small-scale little turbulent features that I'm going to get to into models. So this stuff is from a guy who came, Bertrand Chaperon, who works in Brest in France. So kind of very recent analysis is to take visual images of the ocean from satellites and do what's called glitter analysis, where you use the fact that there's that the sea surface is rough. And what do you see here, right? The fact that you see a variation. You can sense the structure of the ocean from the way that light is reflecting off of it, to keep it in very simple terms. Okay, so you can get more complicated and try to infer currents from this kind of analysis as well. And when you do this, you end up being able to image much finer scale features. And so now we're down to things, these little things that we thought were just ripples on the edge of the sea surface temperature fronts turn out to be even smaller vortices. And in fact, I can zoom in here and you can see little, even smaller vortices on the edge of this vortex. So, yeah, if there's kind of a fascinating array of turbulent motions going on at every scale. Every time we look a little bit closer, we see more stuff. Okay, so that's 10 kilometers. If you remember, those eddies before were about 100 kilometers across. Okay, glitter analysis, finer and finer scale picture of what's going on in the ocean. I'm going to go on to a few more observations, getting more and more recent. One of the, and so still everything I've shown you has been at the surface, right? So even though we see all this complicated stuff going on, we still are blind in terms of what's going on inside the ocean. Not surprisingly, our views of even how eddies work, till extremely recently, have been guided by a bit of a lack of imagination. Most theories for these eddies use what's called a two-layer model, where we take the ocean and think of it as just two density layers. So imagining the vertical structure of these things as being very simple in the vertical. A bit of a lack of imagination. In fact, it turns out that they're more complex. But so this is a very recent kind of observation. So seismic oceanography. So one of the ways oil companies do this a lot, they map the seafloor with a towed array that looks like this. They have a ship going along, and there is a long tethered thing on here with hydrophones that are listening to acoustic signals. And there's a little gun, an air gun, at the edge of the boat, or maybe towed on another tether, that's regularly making loud air bursts into the water. These guys send a signal down, and by considering where that sound is picked up, you can figure out the travel time. And if you assume that no reflection has happened in the water, by looking at the distance along there and the travel time, you can infer the structure of the bottom of the ocean. What they discovered just in a paper in 2003, my notes are gone, by Holbrook, who's a big guy in this field, is that in fact many of the reflections were happening in the water itself, because small changes in temperature and salinity in the water change the sound speed, so they give an impedance to the signal, and that reflects part of the signal back. And they figured out how to kind of map this out and have tested it, and what it gives you is this kind of an incredible picture of little fine-scale structures in the ocean. So it's now, they're using this technique that was just to measure the floor to actually image the interior of the ocean on quite fine scales. So this is a pretty big view, 130 kilometers, 4 kilometers deep, the North Atlantic front, but it gives you, by doing two transects, it gives you a time-dependent picture that's at least a 2D slice of the 3D picture. And what you can see is that the interior structure that's changed just over, I think, on the order of weeks, there's a complicated mess of large-scale motions that are possibly connected to these other eddy structures. So I'm not going too far in interpreting that. That's a bit vague, but let's look at a more compelling example. Actually, so what they sometimes find are coherent structures, a particular one that's called a meddy. The word meddy comes from, it's an eddy that was produced by Mediterranean seawater. So the Mediterranean, because it's hot and shallow, tends to be very salty. And at the Strait of Gibraltar, that water that comes out of the Mediterranean, which is over there, sinks down to its level of neutral buoyancy and then moves out into the Atlantic. Often in this flow, there are big vortices formed that you cannot see from the surface at all. Called meddies. They're these lens-shaped vortices. So they're kind of spinning around. They kind of have a typical vertical structure of 500 meters, typical horizontal structure of 100 kilometers. And here's one that was imaged completely from this seismic analysis. And this is actually the subject of a paper that I reviewed last year by a scientist named Bachelin Hua, who unfortunately just passed away, a very well-known scientist in France. This is incredibly recent stuff to actually be able to image these structures. So what's happening is those sound beams are reflecting at different rates. So that little dark part versus the white part means there's been a change in the temperature salinity combination of the water. We call that fine scale structure. And how these big structures might lead to the generation of these kind of fine scale layerings, which have been seen in other data, is another topic of research, and how and goes into trying to understand how vertical mixing in the ocean happens, which we'll come back to the biology part. Okay, enough there. Fantastic imaging method, and you can see structures that you couldn't before. So last part of the talk, or second to last part, let me just tell you why you should care about biology and the ocean and how it connects to climate. So, a bit of a complicated plot. Again, recall the first thing, this euphotic zone is maybe the top 50 to 100 meters of water. That's the upper ocean layer that's getting enough light from the sun that the little bugs that live up there can photosynthesize. The bugs that live up there we call phytoplankton and algae, and they are autotrophs that primarily take energy from the sun, and they photosynthesize. They use chlorophyll, which looks green, and they take the water that's in there and the carbon dioxide, which has been dissolved into the surface, and add a little bit of light, and they turn that into sugar is one kind, or any number of complex carbohydrates, plus a little oxygen. So you stick CO2 in, and you get sugar and oxygen out. The oxygen goes back out, and that's the source of about half the oxygen on Earth. And it's also half, right? So this is not like a small effect. Phytoplankton in the ocean, in the upper surface, these tiny guys that are far too small to see. This is kind of collection of, it's not just one thing. It's many kinds of diatoms, these small, very small creatures that photosynthesize. Plants, really. And there's a second part of this whole process where this process can get undone by bacteria, but let's skip over that and keep this a little bit easier. So the CO2 goes in, forms glucose, and now if you also have, so these guys don't just photosynthesize, these are little creatures that have cells, and those cells need nutrients to survive and to be made in the first place. And what you need are nutrients, primarily nitrogen, nitrates, and so once you've got that glucose and some nitrates, you can grow things. And what happens in here now, apart from the phytoplankton, there are also zooplankton like krill, slightly bigger shrimp-like things that come around and eat those phytoplankton, and they create fecal pellets and they die. And they basically take that carbon that's in that living matter in the euphotic zone, and by eating it and dying, they then fall down to the bottom of the ocean, where that carbon is then sequestered. So it's a net draw of carbon. The carbon comes in from carbon dioxide at the surface, goes into these creatures, and then gets sucked down to the bottom. So the thing about this whole process, though, the limiting thing, there's a lot of things going on, but the limiting thing is the nutrient cycle, which is complicated, the nitrogen cycle. I won't try to explain it, this is not my field. But this process is limited by how much nutrient can get there. And why is this arrow going up? Well, it turns out most of the nutrient needed to make this, this whole process work comes from the deep ocean. How does nutrient get from the deep ocean upwards? Well, you can have the slow process of this kind of general background small-scale mixing, or more active turbulence can actually do a much better job at drawing up nutrients from the deep and promoting rapid growth of the phytoplankton community. And this is actually what leads to things like the red bloom. There was a massive red bloom that happened off the coast of UAE, I think in 2009, on the coast that's between the two parts of Oman. I don't remember what that's called. But these things are possibly connected to the turbulence. So how do we, okay, I'll have one more slide before I come back to the turbulence part, just to point out how dramatic this effect is. Here's a little picture of the carbon cycle on Earth. And we all know that carbon is a major player in determining the temperature of the planet, and that when we burn fossil fuels, we put carbon into the atmosphere. The level of carbon in the atmosphere has grown over the last centuries from the industrial era. And the ocean, by this process, is clearly playing a big role in trying to take that carbon back out. Well, let's compare how much carbon is around. So they're in whatever units I'm forgetting. Let's forget about the units, think it as non-dimensional. The atmosphere has 750. All of the biosphere, all of the plants and animals on land, 3,000. All the coal and gas in the world, just another 3,000. The deep ocean, 38,000. So it's an order of magnitude bigger than its store of carbon than all the other carbon that we think about. That I find a dramatic fact. And how'd that stuff get there? It got there by little phytoplankton being eaten by krill, and the krill pooping and then taking that stuff down over billions of years. So now back to how this connects to these really recent observations of turbulence. Well, another thing you can see from satellites, and other bands, you can see ocean color. Well, chlorophyll has color, and if you know what you're doing and know which bands to look at, you can infer the concentration of chlorophyll in the upper ocean. And when you look at chlorophyll, and this is just one of a gazillion images like this, you see dramatic pictures that look a lot like those sea surface temperature pictures and the glitter pictures, where the chlorophyll is clearly lining up with the kind of small-scale fronts and turbulence that we saw from other evidence. And what's happening there is that these turbulent fronts that we've only recently seen or understood the prevalence of, fronts are regions of very strong upwelling, very strong vertical velocities, particularly from the deep. So these frontal structures, which are, you know, on the order of much smaller than what the satellites can see, the sea surface, the altimeters can see, are they are these little veins that are spreading all over the ocean that are regions of intense upwelling, and they are the things that are largely responsible for drawing nutrients up from the deep and fueling. And because it's the nutrients that are limiting this cycle in the upper ocean, the turbulence turns out to make, and the structure of this kind of new kind of turbulence on order of kilometer scales, it plays a huge role then in the carbon cycle because of these intense vertical velocities inside these fronts. That's the big picture. I'm just going to close with going back to an old map, what I put on my flyer. So I've given you the main message I wanted to get. This is sort of cute, but it's pretty cool. So there's this map called the Carta Marina that was made by this Swedish Norwegian archbishop in 1539. So there's Norway and Iceland and lots of cute little sea creatures all over. If we put a little frame up there and then blow up on that part, he's got these little kind of swirling patches in there, okay? that look like eddies. Now, given how random and crazy all this stuff looks, you might rightly think that he's just doodling. Although here's one feature that he's made that is known to exist, that's actually a maelstrom, which do happen off the coast of Norway. They happen from the dramatic tides flowing in into and out of the fjord. So there's a huge current of water that creates enough vorticity to actually make a whirlpool. If you've never read it, Poe's Descent into the Maelstrom is a great little story about that. But let's not focus on that. Let's focus on these kind of little random eddies around there. So an oceanographer named Tom Rosby wrote a paper. He looked at this map and noticed that these swirls, and this is true if you looked at the big map too, the swirls tend to all be concentrated in this kind of region between Iceland and the coast of Norway. Well, it turns out if we look at other data that from mean measurements of hydrography, we know that along that same area there's a front, a big front, not the little kind of front I was talking about before, but there's warmer water here and colder water there. It's called the Iceland-Faroe front, and it's actually I think I left out a picture. There's actually a kind of topographic ridge under there, a kind of underwater mountain ridge that goes along there too, along the location of this front. Okay. And now if we look at sea surface height, the sea surface height anomaly that shows us eddies, in fact, what we find is that eddies are concentrated along this front. Eddies tend to form, I didn't get into the theory of what causes eddies, but they are caused from potential energy that's stored in horizontal contrast and density. Okay, so you can imagine if you have oil and water, right? Oil is lighter than water, and if the interface is flat, it's happy, but if you could somehow tilt that interface up, you'd have some denser water over here that's at a higher level than the lighter oil here, and it's going to be unstable. It's basically the process that gives us eddies in the ocean and storms in the atmosphere. But anyway, so that front's there, and you actually do see eddies in the satellite along that region. You can see it more dramatically in a picture like this, which is this kind of imaging of thermal fronts, these kind of smaller scale thermal fronts. So that's kind of cool. He wrote this paper and argued that in fact Magnus actually probably had collected correct observations from sailors that there really were enhanced eddy activity in this region, and wanted to take that into account to guide sailors. So even though I'm in the theme of a lack of imagination, I'm not sure how to close that statement. I'm going to stop there though.
I started out with a very superficial picture of the ocean, and now I see all these different structures.
Good.
And
yeah.
so is there a bigger structure or a main structure that actually holds them all together, or is that still being explored?
I think in some ways the bigger structure is the thing that we have a pretty good view of the big structure. So these kind of simple models that I was talking about that were developed in the 40s, 50s, and 60s that give us a sense of the mean circulation, the kind of average circulation, these gyres, big gyres that are connecting water, from one side of the ocean to the other, and similar models for the kind of vertical overturning structure. So we have a fairly good sense of that, although there's a big caveat that I'll get to. What we sort of discovered with all these new observations is this additional layer that changes the dynamic. It turns out that the smaller scale turbulence changes the large scale circulation too, so that if you want to make a numerical model for predicting climate and you want your ocean to be right, because the ocean is needed to get the heating and the transport of heat correct and also the biology correct, it turns out that if you don't have enough big enough computer to resolve the structure, these eddy structures, your prediction for the mean circulation will be very wrong. So, and then your prediction for climate will be wrong. So these eddies are actually changing the large scale structure. That it's a two-way thing, right? It's not as though there's a big structure that's holding these little guys. The big structure is creating the little turbulence, and the turbulence is then having a back reaction on the large scale circulation.
Presumably the eddies are not permanent and they're not stable permanently. So what is their range of lifetimes?
That's a good question. Yeah, they are, of course, constantly being generated and dissipated. So in that picture way back one. Maybe I'll show you the big one of the eddies, the kind of global picture there. You can see they tend to be, they're not actually ubiquitous, right? They're concentrated in certain areas. So where are they concentrated? That's the Gulf Stream, which is also a big front between colder waters up here and warmer waters there. And they are heavily concentrated in the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which is in fact where most of the eddies in the world are and where they have the most dramatic effect on the mean circulation of the ocean. Anyway, not quite your question yet. So this process that generates them is something called baroclinic instability. It's the thing that I was trying to explain with the oil and water analogy, that you've got some potential energy stored in tilted surfaces of density. So you can see that, you know, when surfaces of density like this are tilted, there's potential energy there, and that gets released through this instability, and it generates eddies, and for more complicated reasons, those eddies tend to have a scale of maybe a few hundred kilometers. They get generated and over the course of about a month, but they can travel, some of them can live as long as 2 years. Some of them dissipate more quickly. It varies quite a bit as a function of latitude and location and size, but the growth rate for them is on order of days to a month, and they live maybe, you know, 5-ish times longer than that on average.
So I was going to talk about the Southern Ocean. Is that the one that doesn't? So the Southern Ocean current moves west to east.
Brilliant question. I'm not just saying that because you gave me a nice introduction either. In fact, that's a good point. So what David's pointing out is, in case you don't know, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. So the Southern Ocean is the one part of the ocean in the world that's connected around the globe. And it tends to be the largest, strongest circulation pattern because of that. It's not obstructed by any continents. So it doesn't have a gyre like the other parts, right? And you can see, if you ever forget which way it goes, just look at the southern tip of South America. So the Drake Passage there, you can kind of see that the water is spread out the land a little bit, right? So the water is going this way from west to east, but as I said, for reasons I didn't explain, the eddies typically go from east to west. They are still trying to do that, but they're being swept upstream by the current. That's called Doppler shifting, and as much as we think of these eddies as waves, which they have a lot of wave-like characteristics. So that's exactly right. Some of those eddies tend to actually go this way, but it's because they're being swept by the mean current.
If I use analogy of a teacup, there are lots of turbulence because somebody's stirring it.
Yep.
If I take away the spoon, all the motion will eventually die out.
Yes.
What are the driving forces in all the motion, all the potential and kinetic energy in the ocean? The primary drivers, can you attribute percentage-wise to all these factors?
Fusion in the sun. So the fusion in the sun is generating tremendous amounts of heat that's going to continue coming out for billions of years. That solar energy enters the Earth, and it enters at different rates as a function of latitude. Most of the solar energy comes in near the equator because there's a much larger surface area of the Earth along the equator facing the direction of the sun than there is at high latitudes. High latitudes, those rays come in and they get spread out over a larger area. So this is why we have a differential in temperature from equator to pole. That differential in temperature from equator to pole is what leads to essentially these, in a very vague sense, what leads to these kind of sloping structures of density on average in the ocean, and likewise in the atmosphere too. There's sloping surfaces of temperature. It's that, so the sun is pumping energy into the Earth. Part of that energy is getting stored in this potential energy of the mean density or temperature structure. And then the turbulence, this instability process is constantly, the sun's pumping it up, it's maybe trying to tilt these surfaces of density upwards. The instability is creating eddies and drawing them back down. It's a constant battle between the two. And then the question is, where does the energy in the eddies go? And that is another amazingly unanswered current question. How does the energy get out of the eddy field, which actually accounts for about half the kinetic energy in the ocean? Most of the kinetic energy in the ocean is in the eddies. And yet we don't know. It's small compared to the potential energy. It's about 1,000 times smaller than the potential energy stored in these surfaces. But all of this kinetic energy in those eddies, we don't really know where it goes. That's a current topic of research. But so there is an energy balance somehow, right? The energy is coming in from the sun, and it's everything coming in from the sun is ultimately being dissipated. Where does the energy in your teacup go? Do you know? It's heat. It's just a little bit of heat. There's friction, right? That ends up making the molecules in your cup and the water vibrate a little more. It's such a small amount of heat that you don't notice it, but in fact, that's what's happening. And over time, the dissipation of turbulent and mean circulations in the atmosphere and ocean are actually, some of it's slowing down the Earth a little bit too. So energy is still conserved.
My question, how is it? But I want to ask that as we spoke about air currents, we spoke about the energy in the sea and oceans, can we answer or can we comment on some of the myths related with the Bermuda Triangle?
All that comes to mind is that my mother had a macabre sense of humor. She thought it was really fun to read me childhood stories from Ripley's Believe It or Not. So I'm still a little scared of the Bermuda Triangle because she'd read me stories about about planes disappearing. But no, I can't tell you anything about it from a scientific point of view, whether there's any validity to it. I'm sorry.
Any relation between the whale movement and the eddy currents?
You're asking about a connection between the eddies and the whales?
Because the ecological scientists, some of them, they do relate the whales to the currents too.
Yes. So there's a process. This is also a very recent idea. And if I went back to this, well, right there, I said less about this particular slide than any there, so I didn't go into this much. But this idea of trying to understand what we call the overturning circulation, how water moves north and sinks at the poles and then gently upwells everywhere. This was the model that they proposed that turned out not to be right. What's really happening is water is being constantly mixed by small-scale internal waves, the kind of waves that would form if you take that oil and water and you shake it a little bit, little waves will form on the interface. And if you've got enough of a velocity shear, those waves will break and they'll mix densities, okay? So, and how much mixing takes place determines this overturning rate of water being exchanged from the surface and the deep. It's dependent on this kind of small-scale mixing from breaking internal waves. Well, there's at least, there's one paper, or maybe a few papers, arguing that a significant, not all, but some significant fraction of the mixing in the ocean, the vertical mixing of densities, is maybe caused by, they call it biomixing, by everything from giant squids down to little fish swimming along, density interfaces and actually generating mixing. I won't comment on how likely that is or how big a part because I don't know the numbers, but it's a field of current controversy and it's something that people write papers about right now.